Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Josh Mullen, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a major Liberal Party initiative aimed at what he called securing Canadian sovereignty. The announcement laid out four key pillars: a complete overhaul of defense procurement, including a new quote-unquote Buy Canadian provision, the creation of a Bureau of Research, Engineering, and Advanced Leadership in Science to equip the military with cutting-edge technology, a push to diversify Canada's trade relationships and strengthen domestic industries, and a significant boost to domestic defense production, including potential collaboration through the EU's Rearming Europe initiative. Coming just 2 weeks ahead of the federal election, this marks the latest in a string of defense-related pledges from the Liberals, part of a broader campaign focus on security, sovereignty, and Canada's role in an increasingly unstable world. It's also worth noting that the Conservatives have made similar moves, putting forward their own promises on military investment and national defense. So, what does this all signal? Today, Justin Massie, Chuck Davies, and Gordon Venner join us in the pod to break it all down for us. Justin Massie and Chuck Davies are CDAI fellows. Gordon Venner is a former Senior Deputy Minister of Defense and former Vice Chair of the CDAI Board of Directors. This is the Expert Series. Morning, Justin. Great to have you on the pod again today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, as we've been discussing with some of the other fellows on this episode, the Liberal Party made some more announcements yesterday as part of the ongoing election campaign, this time about defense spending, defense procurement. It seemed to me that in the announcement on defense, there was four kind of major key pillars. I'm wondering if you might be able to dissect them for us, provide some analysis of them, and also maybe contrast them with any other announcements that have been made by, the Conservative Party, for instance.
Well, let me just start by saying I'm pleased to be discussing defense issues during this election. It's a rare event that we discuss defense issues, that are announcements, statements by major parties, and I welcome this. And what was announced yesterday by Prime Minister Carney is in the right direction, but as many have noticed, it lacked crucial details, and I would add to this, it lacks ambition. So one of the key initiative that was promoted is this Borealis initiative on innovation. And we know that innovation it should be a key pillar of any defense industrial strategy Canada might come up with. Uh, but there are so many details, so many lacking details, and perhaps even ambition. First of all, we don't know what the mandate of that organization will be compared to the RDC that does some research and innovation. And is it the equivalent of DARPA in the United States or of the UK's Defense Science and Technology portfolio, South Korea's Defense Innovation 4.0, or Sweden's Defense Research Agency? Are those types of agencies behind that logic of Borealis, sorry? And if it's so, then what's its budget? What's its ambition? What's the scope of its research? Because we know that we need long-term sustained funding for R&D, for innovation. It can be just promoted on specific capabilities, but needs to be a sustained effort. And so the steady funding also for dual use R&D, so not just for military capabilities, but also for commercial use as well. So if it is going to create something similar to the examples I mentioned, I think it would be great. But if it's just some small scale paper organization that's going to duplicate what's already been done, this will be, of course, counterproductive. A second thing, of course, that was announced is the desire again. Because it was proposed in the 2015 election, the 2019 election, of creating a defense procurement agency. Like several other people, I agree that we should streamline, centralize the acquisition process. I'm wondering if it's going to materialize this time, because it does need major new legislation and processes to be implemented. Um, and I like the idea of prioritizing to buy Canadian products when it's possible. But at the same time, Prime Minister Carney said we need to diversify away from the US, and we need to strike a balance between what we can actually build in Canada and what we cannot build in Canada, and we need to procure elsewhere. We shouldn't be just a chain in a vast supply chain, just just a part of it, but in some industry, and we need to identify those key industry poles. Where should Canada invest in niche capabilities? Of course, we can come with the examples of the aerospace industry that is quite significant in Canada, the naval industry as well. But specifically, what should Canada be building at home, knowing that the cost may be greater, but has major economic and strategic advantages of despite these increased costs. For instance, when Prime Minister Carney tried to justify this announcement, he said our sovereignty is under threat by the United States, notably. Now, we need to identify what that threat is specifically to define what capable, like how much more should we be spending in Canada despite the increased cost. If it is that we're expecting a land invasion by the US on Canada, I don't think any of these strategies will work. But if it is more, the threat that I'm seeing is a strategic abandonment of Canada's defense by the United States. So the unwillingness of the U.S. to come to Canada's aid, or even to encroach on its sovereignty in the Arctic, then some capabilities will need to be built in Canada with little dependencies abroad, even in Europe, even in the U.S., so that we have certain capabilities of being able to detect, to deter, ideally, and perhaps defeat some capabilities, some adversaries that can come in Canadian territories. But we can't do that on every weapon systems. And so this industrial strategy that is being developed in Ottawa right now, then should be announced after the election, will be key to clarify some of the perhaps ambiguity that came with Carney's announcement yesterday, by identifying those poles where Canada can fit, and what are the big companies that we can create a sustained dialogue with the industry. It needs to be upstream, not downstream. The Canada's defense acquisition is, we first come up with what we want, and it's very, very specific, and then we see if the industry can do it. And then if they can't, we buy elsewhere outside Canada. This is not the way other agencies in Sweden, France, and elsewhere, or South Korea proceed. They actually consult prior to defining the military capabilities needed, based on the performance, based on what's needed in terms of the security needs. And through those consultations and the sustained investment in innovation, research, and development, then we can know what our industry can do and what it can't do, and what we need to buy or develop procurement, mutual procurement processes with other countries. And so I hopefully some of these details will be sketched out in the forthcoming defense platform of the Liberal Party, and of course of the other major parties. But at this point, I think it's the right direction, but there's a lot of question raised by this announcement.
Well, that's a great introduction and great analysis, Justin. I'm wondering if you might be able to contrast this latest announcement and perhaps some of the earlier Liberal announcements with maybe some of the promises that have been made by the Conservative Party, where they might be similar, where they differ, and maybe what the respective announcements might tell us at this point about the strategic worldview, if you will, about maybe the parties or the leaders.
I think both major parties agree that the ambition should be to defend Canada first. So the Canada First motto of the Conservative, I think, is very similar to what the Liberals are proposing. I think the Liberals are a bit more clear on the lack of trust with the United States than the Conservatives, and then like that's for electoral purposes. But I think on the um, more profoundly, I think the Conservatives and the Liberals agree that Canada needs to reduce or mitigate the risk of the United States by not decoupling, but perhaps duplicating or creating resiliency in Canada's military industry, diversifying our acquisition with Europe, but also developing some niche capabilities here. But in terms of the details, the Conservatives have been much more shy. They've only announced that they want to create a permanent base in the Arctic, double the polar icebreakers, and double the Rangers. That's not enough, of course, to defend Canada in a context where the U.S. could stop protecting our country and even encroaching on our sovereignty. And perhaps in the coming, 13 days till the end of this election, more details will be forthcoming from the Conservatives. But so far, the Liberals have come up with more announcements on this issue. Still not enough to address the huge threat that they are both recognizing, acknowledging, but still in the right direction.
I'm wondering if we can also discuss, you know, Canada's potential involvement in Europe's recently announced Rearm initiative or strategy, which was a defense white paper put out, I think probably just a little over a month ago. I noticed one of the goals of the Liberal announcement was to strengthen Canada's domestic defense industry. So, like in practical terms, how could involvement in something like Rearm Europe contribute to that initiative? And are there specific sectors or capabilities where Canadian firms could be well positioned to contribute?
Well, that's the thing. The Europeans may spend and up to is very important word here, $800 billion in the next couple of years. It's up to because it's only a permission to spend more and create deficits. It's like an authorization to have more deficits. So it's not clear that all European countries will be spending more, but we do know that the Germans have just adopted legislation that will allow them to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in their industry to lessen their dependencies on the US, the same thing that Canada should be doing. So there's a harmony of convergence of interests here between Canada and Europeans. And Europeans don't have the industry sufficient to modernize and autonomize their military alone. So they do need cooperation, and they've listed a couple of countries with which they could strike security and defense partnerships, such as Norway, the UK, South Korea, and Canada. And of course, we need to seize that opportunity. But then Canada's industrial strategy needs to identify and support our industry where they can export to this market. Because what's happening now is uh, we don't have that sort of support, sustained support for Canadian industry to export its capabilities abroad. Permits are hard to get. The diplomatic support that some other countries have in terms of bringing their industry in missions abroad are lacking. We don't see, for instance, when the Prime Minister Carney made his announcement yesterday, it was in Bombardier, a big company, aerospace company in Montreal, where they could be supporting Bombardier's development of certain capabilities in this Rearm program in Europe to see where this Canadian industry can fit in whatever the Europeans are going to buy. And what's great about the Rearm program is they've actually listed the capabilities they need more in scale and more in autonomy. That includes, of course, ISR, communication systems, long range missile systems, air defense systems. And then it's unclear to me yet in which of these sectors Canada can integrate in those supply chains or even build in Canada and export to Europeans because they won't be able to buy everything in Europe because they don't have the sufficient industry to do so alone.
Well, one last question I had for you, Justin. Is it realistic for Canada to increase its defense spending to meet and surpass NATO's 2% target, while also prioritizing potentially made in Canada procurement, diversifying away from U.S. suppliers? And what challenges might arise in balancing some of these goals?
I think the balance is more between social spending programs and military defense spending, more than within the military industry, between diversifying buying Canada, because buying Canada will be more expensive than buying abroad usually. If history is a provider of an example in this, um, but I think it's realistic in the sense that there's a political opportunity we see now that I haven't seen in decades, where all political parties, I should say, because the NDP, the Green Party, and the Bloc Québécois all support achieving 2% of GDP in NATO. I haven't seen this ever, and so there's a political opportunity to invest. There's a social acceptability in the public that we need to invest in Canadian armed forces, and so I think it's very much realistic. Also, given that we've done it in the past for decades. Canada has spent more than 2% of GDP during the Cold War. And so if we could do it and we still have a welfare system then, and we can do it again. But perhaps that reducing income taxes every year may not be the great way to have the revenues to invest in military. And that this is, I think, where the balance needs to be struck. And so far, both major parties have provided, have pledged, to reduce income taxes. So I don't see that as aligned with the need to invest more in Canadian military. But we can only blame politicians for this because they're facing the easiest or more permissive environment I haven't seen in decades to invest significantly in Canadian armed forces. And if they don't seize it, they will not be able to blame opposition parties, the public, or anything else but themselves.
Justin, thanks for joining me today to discuss this latest Liberal announcement, and thanks for also providing some analysis of the other defense announcements. I agree, it's a very interesting time in that all the parties are making defense pledges and supporting defense in a way that is, likely quite unprecedented for some time. So good to have you on, and appreciate your thought leadership and commentary as always.
Well, thank you very much. It was great.
For this episode, we also spoke to Chuck Davies, who provided his own commentary on the defense announcement yesterday. So let's turn to a recording of a discussion we had with him earlier. Just to set us up, yesterday, Prime Minister Carney unveiled the new Liberal Party initiative aimed at, and I quote, securing Canadian sovereignty. From what I can tell, the announcement focused on 4 key pillars. I'm wondering if you might be able to dive into some of those pillars, provide your kind of initial assessment of what's been promised in the announcements and what you think about it.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is procurement reform, which is interesting. It comes across as being a recycled 2019 Liberal Party commitment to create this Defence Procurement Canada construct. I don't have a problem with centralizing authority. I think I've been advocating for centralizing responsibility for defense procurement, but in my view, it needs to be done within a broader context of an integrated system or integrated structure for supporting CAF equipment and operations and capabilities. And I note that, for example, in Australia and the UK, and even within NATO itself, the NATO Defence and Procurement Agency, Procurement and Support Agency, um, those countries and others have an integrated service provider that does procurement, but it also does the life cycle management of equipment and the material and contracted support to military operations and capabilities. And that's where I believe Canada needs to go to. This has the initial appearance of a standalone procurement-focused organization, which I think will simply move boundaries within an already fractured construct. So that's where my main concern would be on that one. The second one is the focus on AI. And I think the Institute just a couple of months ago published an excellent excellent edition of On Track that addresses this very thing. And I think that there is a lot in that edition of On Track that would usefully inform the direction the government wants to take on this Bureau of Research, Engineering, and Advanced Leadership in Science. And I very much think that that's past due. That's something we should have been moving on earlier. And I'm very glad to see that this is on the radar screen for the Liberal Party, at least if they form government. Third area I see is defense businesses and support to industry. And that means exports. And that has been tried a number of times in the past. I think there's probably more of a national appetite to be supportive of defense exports than there has been in past years, just because of the global dynamics. But industries in Canada, all industries in Canada, defense industries in particular, can only survive with an export market that allows them to filling gaps between Canadian procurements, invest in new intellectual property development, and to really grow the business. And then there are a range of things that they're planning to do to rebuild, reinvest, and rearm the Canadian Armed Forces. Pay rise for the Armed Forces is always nice. They got, I think they got a pay bump last year or about a year ago. I do agree that the increasing the stock in housing on and around bases is critical. It's some of that housing certainly was in the years when I was using it left something to be desired. And then modernizing recruiting, and I think there's another area of focus which carries on from our North Strong and Free, the last Liberal Party defense policy, which is a focus on Arctic security with platforms and undersea systems, drones, and those kinds of things. There's a funny one that I'm scratching my head at, and as a former Army officer, I should be cheering them, but they're planning to ensure that Canadian troops defending Canada at home have the same equipment and capabilities as those deployed overseas. And I'm asking myself why. Because in the Latvia mission in particular, that has to be a heavy tank on tank, armor on armor, infantry close fight kind of fighting force. And it is difficult to see that kind of a threat in the North American context against anybody other than our American neighbors. And I think that equipping the Canadian Armed Forces to do heavy combat here in Canada beyond what is needed to be able to train to do the heavy combat operations overseas may not be the best use of resources. And then finally, I think there's an interesting comment about broadening their Canadian Coast Guard mandate, which I think is good. So there's all of that is very good. I will note that Trudeau government also made a lot of commitments and said a lot of nice things, in particular the defense industrial support for Ukraine and so on, and delivered little, and whatever was delivered very, very slowly. My sense is that Mr. Carney, if he becomes the prime minister, will have a much greater emphasis on actual delivery, just from what we've seen in the short time he's been around. So those are my initial thoughts at it. Interesting document. I believe there is going to be a need for a new government, whether it's a Liberal, Conservative, or anybody else, to do a fundamental reset of Canadian defense policy. And there's a lot in here that kind of speaks to the kinds of things that might need to go into that process.
Thanks for that overview, Chuck. I'm wondering if we can also discuss perhaps some of the promises made in the Conservative platform. I'm not sure if you have that information readily available, but this is kind of an interesting election in the sense that both parties have been making announcements and promises around defense spending and have made some defense-focused announcements, which, I'm a young guy, but we usually don't see in a Canadian election often. I'm wondering if you can comment that, as well as maybe compare and contrast some of the announcements made by both parties. And I mean, you'll excuse me, I'm excluding the NDP from this, which I think has made a few announcements as well. But right now, it looks like the race is really between the Conservatives and the Liberals.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't have the Conservative one in front of me, but I do recall some of the things that they'd be speaking about. One of them is to create a military base in Iqaluit. Interesting, possibly, quite probably necessary. But my thinking is that before you figure out that you want to put a base here or buy a particular capability there, you kind of need to do some thinking about what is your defense and security strategy for that region. And that out of that will flow, okay, I need this kind of base here and that kind of base there. So I don't know what sort of base they have in mind for Iqaluit. Um, or whether certainly a logistics hub would make sense to me as a former logistics officer. Um, but in terms of an operational base with an operational mission, what's the mission to do what for what purpose and so on. And in that respect, there's a little bit of that in the Liberal uh, shopping list as well, talking about particular platforms, but in the absence of any articulation of a broader strategy. And I don't fault either party for that, because what they're producing now is not a strategy document. It's not a policy document. It is a series of commitments. But at some point before money gets spent and shovels go into the ground and a new base anywhere, you need to know why you're building it, what it's going to do, and what you're going to accomplish with that. The other interesting commentary I've heard from the Conservatives is, yeah, we're going to work towards getting to the NATO 2% of GDP level, a little more slowly, I think, than what the Liberals have been talking about. And I think that the Conservatives still are grappling with their focus on the national finances and getting them in order. And there's a certain logic to that, as Churchill wrote many years ago. The power of any government depends ultimately on its finances. And whether you're investing in social services or defense or whatever, you need to get the country's finances in order. So I do understand that. The problem, of course, that we face is we don't have a lot of time to get our defenses up to a level that might realistically contribute to a collective effort to deter a major global war.
Well, Chuck, thanks for joining us to break down this latest Liberal announcement, and also break down some of the other defense announcements that have been made amidst this election, which is now just under 2 weeks away. Great to have you on again. Earlier today, we also spoke with Gordon Venner, so let's turn to him now before closing out the pod. Hi, Gord. Thanks for joining us today. Why don't we get right to it and unpack not only the recent Liberal announcement, but previous campaign announcements made by both parties.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. This announcement was just made yesterday, and there'll be a little bit of take a little bit of time for it to sink in and for people to fully understand some of the implications, and hopefully we might get more details before the election date on some of the elements that are in here. The first thing I just want to note, though, is that the very fact that this statement exists and that it goes into the detail that it does is a good thing. In recent elections in this country, very little attention has been paid to defense and national security issues or to the foreign policy issues that frequently intersect with defense and national security questions. In fact, if you go back just to the last election and think about the amount of attention that was paid to it, and granted, we were coming out of COVID at the time, but there was almost no discussion at all of national defense and security issues. I think at one point during the campaign, there was a little bit of flurry of activity around the issue of the patriation of people from Afghanistan who would help the Canadian forces during the years that they were deployed there. But that was about the only time that national defense and security issues erupted into the federal campaign. And I think, in fairness, we have to note that while this statement came out from the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party yesterday, that in the last few days, we saw a statement from the Leader of the Opposition when he was campaigning in his own constituency, where he also dealt with national defense and security issues in some detail. So I think they both get credit for coming to the table and discussing these issues in a way that we haven't seen for some time in the federal election context. So kudos to both of them. The statement that we're going to focus on now, the one from the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister yesterday, can be broken into two parts. It has four statement sections at the front, and you ably listed on what they deal with. And then in the second half of the statement, there's a reference back to 7 bullets which are a reference to statements made earlier in the campaign that also dealt with security issues. And time permitting, it might be worthwhile just to very quickly remind people of what those are, because some of them do actually relate back to things dealt with in the first half of the statement. So the first half of the statement deals with reinvesting in military industry and diversifying trade in military products. And the first bullet actually gets divided into two halves. It talks about overhauling defense procurement to better meet Canadian needs and the urgency of the moment by doing two things. And the first one of those is establishing a defense procurement agency, modernizing defense procurement rules, and amending legislation and regulations as required to centralize expertise from across the government and streamline the way we buy equipment for the military. So in itself, that first half of the statement makes a lot of sense. Let's just focus on a couple of the elements of it. The very first line there, establishing the Defense Procurement Agency. Okay, we're going to get a new Defense Procurement Agency. That's a big thing, and it suggests that the problems in defense procurement are being taken seriously, and that the new Prime Minister wants to do some things to improve performance in that area, and that's great. But you can see where the criticism for that might come from right away. I mean, how many times in the last few weeks have you heard the leader of the opposition say that all the Liberals ever want to do is create new bureaucracy? So establishing a new defense procurement agency, I wouldn't be surprised if you heard some criticism of that whole idea. And then we don't have a lot of clarity on what this new agency is or how it would work. I don't see the word independent, so I'm not reading that it's an independent defense procurement agency, which would mean independent of other parts of the federal government that already exist. If it were independent, then presumably it would report to a minister. Would it be its own minister? Would it be a minister shared with other government departments and agencies? Heaven knows there's a lot of double hatting going on amongst ministers at the moment. And those are the kind of issues that prime ministers traditionally deal with as machinery of government issues when they're setting up their new administration after an election. So if we do have concerns about that, and if they're important to you and you want to know how that works before you vote, chances are you're not going to get that opportunity. But it does indicate that the issue has been taken seriously. If it's not an independent defense procurement agency, then the question that comes up immediately is, where would you put it? Presumably, you would put it in Public Services and Procurement Canada. It is the procurement department. That's where the expertise on procurement resides. A lot of the expertise resides. So you would put it there. But then the obvious question would be, well, that's what they're doing now. That's their job right now. So why do we need to create another defense procurement body inside a department that is already responsible for a huge amount of the process of defense procurement? Why can't we, if the current system isn't working well, why can't we just fix what we've got rather than focus on creating something new? The language that I just read you refers to centralizing expertise from across the government. Okay, maybe that's a laudable objective, but why can't PSPC centralize expertise from across the government? Not really clear how that works, and I think it would be useful to have that sorted out. And then I would also just draw your attention to the word streamline in the language, which I read a minute ago. Everybody wants to streamline defense procurement. Everybody wants to make it faster, and we want to make it more effective, and we want to get the military capacities and capabilities we need into the hands of our forces as quickly as possible so that they can start using them in, defending the country and asserting our sovereignty and all the important work that they do. But this is where we have to worry about the relationship with the second half of this bullet, because the second half of it says that the government will be buying Canadian wherever possible and prioritizing raw materials such as steel and aluminum and critical metals. okay, well, just as an aside, we can understand the concern with respect to steel and aluminum. The United States has just hit us with major duties on steel and aluminum. If we can use domestically produced steel and aluminum in our own defense projects, that makes a certain amount of sense. I think, frankly, there's a little bit of devil in the details. I'm not quite sure that we always make the right kind of steel to put in our ships, for example. So there may be some challenges there, but uh, but in principle, that makes sense. But what's a little more worrying is that the two halves of this equation don't necessarily mesh together very well. We want to streamline, we want to do things more quickly and more efficiently. We want to buy Canadian uh, goods and services, but sometimes the most efficient, streamlined way to get the capacity into the hands of the Canadian military is to buy existing, off the shelf, proven technologies, um, and that our allies are using and already, and put them in the hands of our forces. And there is an inherent conflict sometimes, not always, between buying Canadian and doing things in the most streamlined and expeditious way. And it's a little bit worrying that this statement, the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party, doesn't acknowledge that conflict. It's a little bit intellectually dishonest to suggest that you can, pursue two objectives which are sometimes mutually exclusive at the same ah. So, and I'll just give you one example of that, Josh. If you go back 15, 20 years, the Canadian Forces was in desperate need of heavy lift aircraft. So go out to that's an important enabler for a lot of military activities. They went out, they bought C-17s that were, Boeing McDonnell Douglas aircraft. Really important thing to do. But nobody said, hey, we can't buy these aircraft because they're not Canadian made. We bought them, and it was a fast, relatively fast procurement exercise. I think there were 4 purchased in the first instance. Later on, when the production line for that particular variant of the aircraft was being shut down, there was an opportunity to buy a 5th one, which the government did as well. It was fast, it was efficient, it got the capacity into the hands of the Canadian military, but it meant that we were, buying airplanes that weren't made in Canada. They may have been Canadian parts sourced in the supply chain, but they weren't principally Canadian aircraft. So sometimes the two objectives aren't right on the same page. Uh, Moving on to the second point, establishing the Bureau of Research, Engineering, and Advanced Leadership in Science to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces and the Communications and Security Establishment have the made in Canada innovative solutions they need in areas such as AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, other advanced research and technology. So again, level of first principles, this is great. This is exactly, one of the things that we need to be worried on. Technological advancement happens so quickly, and it is so important to get this new technologies developed and working for our military as quickly as we can, because if we don't, this can have actual life and death consequences. And that short list is pretty good. AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, other advanced research and technology, which is where I assume we're dealing with outer space issues, makes perfect sense that the government wants to move forward in those areas and important. But I also have to note that now we're establishing a new bureau. In the previous point, we were establishing a new agency, Defense Procurement Agency. Now we're establishing a new bureau. Might hear the same kind of criticism with respect to creating new bodies. And also it makes it sound like we haven't been doing this kind of work all along. Doing advanced research in defense capacities that affect our defense sector is something that the Department of National Defense has a long history of doing, going back decades. EDRC, or sorry, DRDC, the Defense Research and Development Canada, we've been doing, cutting edge work in this area. So not entirely certain what we're doing here that isn't reinventing the wheel. Is this bureau in addition to the structures that have existed in DRDC? Is it in DRDC? I don't understand that. And again, it would be really useful to have a better understanding of how the new initiative fits with the work that's gone on in the past. That takes us to the third point, helping Canadian businesses grow at home and diversify their markets abroad, including by expanding the Canada Export Program to grow their sales internationally. So absolutely, this makes a lot of sense. The Canadian Armed Forces need a defense industrial base that they can rely on to produce equipment from them for their own use. And ensuring the commercial viability of that means that you want to make sure that those industries can sell abroad. And these two things are absolutely connected, because if you're a Canadian defense industry and you want to go abroad and sell to our NATO allies or the countries of Latin America or anywhere else, the first thing they're going to do is ask you, is your own government buying this from you? Are you selling to your own military? Because if your own government doesn't have the confidence in what you're producing and in the products you're making, why would anybody else have any confidence in you? So you need to help them, the industry base, grow and diversify. And there is work that was underway when the writ was issued to try and work towards a new defense and industrial strategy. And it'd be interesting to see after the election whether or not that work continues. Also, we should note that given some of the challenges in our relationship with the United States right now, that diversifying our sources of supply and being able to do a little bit more domestically might be a really useful thing to have. So in principle, good idea. Be nice to have some more details. And that then leads you to the fourth point, which is somewhat related to the third. Sorry, maybe just before I leave the third, Josh, I should just point out that part of the problem that came up in the first one, where you've got this conflict between buying Canadian whenever possible and streamlining things, comes up again here. If you're going to wait forever, if you're prepared to wait a long time, you can develop defense capabilities from scratch and then buy from them. But what you don't want to do is get into the situation where you're growing the industry at home. But what that means is that you're putting in long lead times before you can start buying from that industry in order to supply the forces. So the problem comes up again under that heading. Then the fourth point, boosting Canada's domestic defense industries and production as we build security with our partners. And then this point, there's a specific reference made to the Rearm Europe plan in support of transatlantic security. This makes perfect sense. Again, part of the reason it is particularly poignant at the moment is because of challenges in the Canada-U.S. relationship. If we can do more with our other allies, why wouldn't we? If I had to pick an example of where this might be useful, it might be with respect to submarines. The outgoing government had announced as part of ONSAF the update. ONSAF is Armstrong 3. It was the update to Strong, Secure, Engage, which is the government's existing and now updated defense policy. Had announced that it would be proceeding to replace our old submarines, which spend more time in dry dock than they do in the water, with a new fleet of submarines. The Europeans make submarines, and they make the kind of submarines that we're most likely to buy. We're not likely to buy nuclear submarines. We're looking for diesel electric submarines. So maybe we can be doing some really interesting work with respect to that particular procurement with European partners, why wouldn't we? So on the whole, pretty good idea here. So that's the four elements of the announcement the leader of the Liberal Party made yesterday.
Well, Gord, that's a pretty comprehensive overview, I think, of the announcement. Thanks so much for joining us today for the podcast. We appreciate your thought leadership and your expertise, especially given your time in government and in D&D. So I think our audience will really enjoy these reflections, and I hope we can do this again sometime soon. Take care. That brings us to the end of the pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks for listening. A big thanks once again to our guests, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.